Margaret Chen still remembered the exact temperature that October morning in 2014, 62 degrees, with a crisp autumn breeze that carried the scent of burning leaves through their suburban Denver neighborhood. She remembered because she had checked the weather app twice before letting her 17-year-old daughter Emma walk to school, debating whether to insist she take a jacket. In the end, Emma had rolled her eyes and grabbed her burgundy hoodie, the one with the small hole near the left pocket that Margaret had been meaning to mend. "See you tonight, Mom. Don't forget, I'm staying late for drama club rehearsal." Emma had called from the front door, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight as she turned to wave. Those were the last words Margaret would ever hear her daughter speak. When Emma didn't come home by 8 that evening, Margaret felt the familiar flutter of maternal concern, but nothing more. Emma was responsible, but she was also 17, and sometimes lost track of time with friends. By 9:30, concern had crystallized into worry. By 11, when Emma's phone went straight to voicemail for the 10th time, worry had transformed into the kind of bone-deep fear that would become Margaret's constant companion for the next decade. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from today in the comments below. If you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and moments of justice, please consider subscribing. The police initially treated Emma's disappearance with the casual dismissal reserved for teenage runaways. Officer Bradley, a man whose weathered face suggested he'd seen too many missing persons cases, sat in Margaret's living room the next morning, his notebook barely touched, as he explained that most teens returned home within 48 hours. Emma was a good student, he acknowledged, but good students sometimes made impulsive decisions. Had there been any recent arguments? Any mention of boyfriends her parents disapproved of? Margaret's ex-husband David arrived that afternoon, his usually composed demeanor cracking as he paced the length of their daughter's bedroom. They had divorced 3 years earlier, a quiet, civilized dissolution of a marriage that had simply run its course. But in that moment, their shared terror reunited them in ways their love never could. David's hand shook as he touched Emma's things, the astronomy textbook stacked neatly on her desk, the collection of vintage band t-shirts hanging in her closet, the framed photograph of the three of them from a camping trip to Rocky Mountain National Park, taken just months before their separation. The drama teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, confirmed that Emma had attended rehearsal but left around 4:30, saying she was meeting someone. When pressed, she couldn't remember Emma's exact words, only that she had seemed excited, almost giddy. The security cameras at the school showed Emma walking toward the parking lot, but the footage was grainy, and she disappeared from view before reaching the street. As the first week stretched into a month, Margaret learned the cruel mathematics of hope. Each day that passed decreased the likelihood of Emma's safe return, but each day also brought the possibility of news, of answers, of her daughter walking through the front door with an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. Margaret clung to the statistics Officer Bradley grudgingly shared. 99% of missing children were found within the first year. She would repeat this number like a prayer, even as she watched the detective's expression grow more guarded with each passing week. The search efforts consumed Margaret's existence. She organized volunteer groups that distributed flyers throughout Denver and surrounding counties. Emma's face, smiling, hopeful, forever 17, gazed out from telephone poles, grocery store bulletin boards, and gas station windows. Margaret appeared on local news programs, her voice steady, despite her trembling hands, pleading for information. For someone to remember seeing her daughter, she hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Jack Morrison, who promised to leave no stone unturned, but cautioned her about maintaining realistic expectations. David threw himself into the technical aspects of the search. He created a website, monitored social media for any mention of Emma's name, and coordinated with missing children organizations across the country. He took leave from his job as an engineer, spending 18-hour days in front of his computer, cross-referencing databases, and following leads that led nowhere. Margaret would find him asleep at his desk in the early morning hours, surrounded by printouts of missing persons reports and maps, marked with red pins indicating places Emma might have gone. The theories multiplied like a cancer. Emma had been abducted by a stranger. She had met someone online and run away willingly. She had suffered an accident and was lying injured somewhere, unable to call for help. She had witnessed a crime and gone into hiding. Each possibility felt equally plausible and equally devastating. Margaret found herself studying the faces of homeless women on the street, searching for some familiar feature, some hint of recognition. She called hospitals in neighboring states, describing her daughter's distinguishing marks. A small scar on her chin from a childhood bicycle accident, a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her left shoulder. The first anniversary of Emma's disappearance arrived like a funeral date marked on the calendar. Margaret and David held a candlelight vigil in the park where Emma used to play as a child. Neighbors came, former classmates, teachers who remembered her bright smile and quick wit. But as Margaret looked at the flickering flames reflected in the gathering dusk, she felt not hope, but the settling weight of permanence. Emma had been gone for exactly 1 year, and the world had continued turning without her. The second year brought a different kind of pain. The acute agony of those first months had evolved into a chronic ache, a persistent awareness of absence that colored every moment. Margaret learned to function around her grief, returning to her job as a librarian, maintaining the house, going through the motions of normal life while carrying the constant burden of not knowing. She kept Emma's room exactly as it had been, changing the sheets weekly, dusting the furniture, as if maintaining the space might somehow summon her daughter back into it. Friends and family, well-meaning but exhausted by the prolonged crisis, began to suggest that Margaret should move on. They spoke in gentle euphemisms about closure and acceptance, words that felt like betrayal when applied to her missing child. How could she move on when Emma might be somewhere, waiting for rescue? How could she accept what might not be true? Margaret began to understand why some parents of missing children became reclusive, why they couldn't bear the weight of others, discomfort with ongoing grief. By the third year, Margaret had become a different person entirely. The soft-spoken librarian, who had once worried about enforcing late fees, had transformed into someone harder, more focused, driven by a singular purpose that brooked no interference. She had memorized the faces and case details of every missing person in Colorado, attended support groups where parents shared their own stories of vanished children, and developed an encyclopedic knowledge of investigative techniques that would have impressed seasoned detectives. Her apartment, once a cozy refuge filled with books and plants, had become a command center. One entire wall was covered with maps, photographs, timelines, and charts connecting various pieces of information. Red strings stretched between pushpins, creating a web of possibilities that looked like the work of someone obsessed, someone on the edge of sanity. Perhaps she was. Margaret no longer cared about appearances, or the concerned whispers of neighbors who saw her leaving before dawn to post flyers, or returning after midnight from another fruitless search. The relationship with David had evolved into something resembling a business partnership focused on finding Emma. They met every Sunday to share information, compare notes, and plan the week's activities. Their conversations were businesslike, efficient, drained of the warmth that had once defined their marriage, but powered by a shared determination that felt stronger than love. David had remarried a kind woman named Susan, who understood that his first loyalty would always be to finding his daughter. But Margaret remained alone, unable to imagine caring about anyone else when Emma was still missing. Jack Morrison, the private investigator, had become both ally and source of frustration. He continued to work the case, following leads that occasionally showed promise before dissolving into dead ends. A girl matching Emma's description had been spotted working at a diner in Utah, but when they arrived, she was someone else entirely. A phone tip claimed Emma was living with a cult in New Mexico, but investigation revealed the caller was suffering from mental illness and had provided similar tips about dozens of missing persons. Each false hope was like a small death, another chip in the foundation of Margaret's faith that answers were possible. The fourth year brought Margaret to places she had never imagined she would go. She learned to navigate the dark corners of the internet, where information about trafficking and exploitation circulated among those who made it their business to know such things. She attended conferences on missing persons cases, absorbing knowledge about predators, about the routes commonly used to transport victims, about the signs that might indicate someone was being held against their will. The knowledge was horrifying and necessary, each new piece of information both expanding her understanding and deepening her fears about what might have happened to Emma. She began traveling, following leads across state lines with a determination that bordered on the obsessive. A reported sighting in Phoenix led to a 3-day search through homeless encampments and runaway shelters. A tip about a girl in Las Vegas resulted in Margaret spending a week showing Emma's photograph to casino workers, hotel clerks, and social service providers. Each trip was expensive, both financially and emotionally, but Margaret couldn't bear the thought of not following up, of missing the one lead that might bring Emma home. The toll on her health became impossible to ignore. Margaret lost 30 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had grown sharp and angular. Her hair, once thick and lustrous, became thin and brittle from stress. She developed insomnia, lying awake in the early morning hours, scrolling through missing persons databases, comparing faces, reading case files until her eyes burned. Her doctor prescribed sleeping pills and antidepressants, but Margaret was afraid that medication might dull her vigilance, might make her miss some crucial detail that could lead to Emma. The 5th anniversary of Emma's disappearance passed quietly. The media attention had long since faded, the case relegated to cold case files that gathered dust in police stations. Margaret marked the date by visiting every place Emma had been in her final weeks. The school, the coffee shop where she studied, the park where she had practiced guitar on warm afternoons. She left flowers at each location, small memorials to a presence that had once filled these spaces with laughter and life. It was during this pilgrimage that Margaret met another searcher, a man named Robert, whose 19-year-old son had vanished 6 years earlier. Robert found her sitting on a bench in the park, staring at the stage where Emma had performed in a summer concert just weeks before her disappearance. He didn't speak at first, simply sat beside her and shared the weight of understanding that passed between parents who had lost children to the void of not knowing. "The hardest part," Robert said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "is that everyone else gets to have normal problems. They worry about mortgage payments and job evaluations, and whether their kids are eating enough vegetables. We worry about whether our children are alive." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face for the first time in months. She had become so focused on being strong, on maintaining her search, that she had forgotten how to grieve properly. Robert's words gave her permission to acknowledge the unique burden they carried, the way their lives had been divided into before and after, the way simple pleasures had become impossible when half of their hearts were missing. They began meeting weekly, Robert and Margaret, not for support group therapy, but for the practical sharing of resources and strategies. Robert had connections with law enforcement officers in other states, contacts developed through his own years of searching. Margaret had accumulated a network of social workers, shelter operators, and advocates who knew to watch for children matching certain descriptions. Together, they formed an informal intelligence network, sharing information about cases that might be connected, leads that might cross state lines. As the 6th year began, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She left her job at the library, cashing in her retirement savings to fund what she privately called the final search. If Emma was alive, Margaret reasoned, she was now 23 years old enough to have some control over her circumstances, old enough to reach out if she wanted to be found. If Emma was being held against her will, then 6 years of captivity meant the situation was likely permanent unless outside intervention occurred. If Emma was dead, and Margaret forced herself to consider this possibility, then her remains were hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered by someone who wouldn't give up looking. Margaret sold her apartment and most of her possessions, keeping only the essentials and Emma's belongings. She bought a small RV and began a systematic search of the American West, focusing on areas where young women might disappear without extensive investigation. Remote desert communities, mountain towns where strangers could blend in, agricultural areas where seasonal workers moved without leaving paper trails. She worked her way through Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, following a loose grid pattern that ensured she covered every possible hideout, every forgotten corner where a missing girl might have ended up. The 7th year of Emma's absence found Margaret parked outside a truck stop in Barstow, California, methodically showing Emma's photograph to drivers, waitresses, and anyone who would look. The desert heat shimmered off the asphalt, and Margaret's RV had become a mobile investigation unit, filled with filing cabinets, communication equipment, and detailed maps marked with red pins indicating places she had searched, and blue pins showing locations where tips had been reported. She had become a nomad of hope, following the faintest possibilities across thousands of miles. It was in Barstow that Margaret met Dolores, an elderly woman who managed a support center for runaway and trafficked youth. Dolores had seen Margaret's flyers around town and tracked her down to offer assistance. Over coffee in a diner that smelled of grease and disinfectant, Dolores shared stories that made Margaret's blood run cold. Tales of young women who had been lured away from their families, held for years in conditions that defied imagination, sometimes rescued but often lost forever to a system that preyed on the vulnerable. "The thing you have to understand," Dolores said, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had seen better days, "is that these girls often can't reach out, even when they want to. They're moved, frequently, watched constantly, threatened with harm to their families if they try to escape. Some of them forget who they used to be. Some of them survive by convincing themselves that their old lives were dreams. Margaret absorbed this information with the stoic attention she had developed over years of accumulating knowledge she wished she didn't need. Every new piece of information about the realities of trafficking and exploitation added weight to her understanding of what Emma might be enduring, but also provided new avenues for search. Dolores introduced Margaret to a network of advocates, social workers, and former victims, who worked to identify and rescue women caught in trafficking situations. Through Dolores' connections, Margaret learned about the signs to look for: young women who seemed disconnected from their surroundings, who had no identification or money, who deferred to controlling older men, who showed signs of physical abuse or drug dependency. She began visiting truck stops, massage parlors, and cheap motels, not just to show Emma's photograph, but to look for any young woman who might need help. It was heartbreaking work that yielded no trace of Emma, but occasionally resulted in Margaret providing information that helped other searchers find their missing loved ones. The 8th year brought Margaret to a small town in northern Arizona, where several young women had disappeared over the past decade. The local sheriff, a man named Tom Bradley, who shared a surname with the officer who had first dismissed Emma's case, was different from his Denver counterpart: engaged, thorough, troubled by the pattern of disappearances in his jurisdiction. He welcomed Margaret's assistance, recognizing in her the kind of detailed knowledge that could only come from years of focused investigation. Sheriff Bradley had a theory about the disappearances, one that involved a network of individuals who targeted young women passing through the area. The town was located on a major highway used by truckers and travelers, and several of the missing girls had last been seen at locations along this route. He shared his files with Margaret, including surveillance footage, witness statements, and timelines that showed eerie similarities between cases spanning several years. Margaret spent 3 months in that Arizona town, working with Sheriff Bradley to analyze patterns and investigate leads. They identified several suspects, including a man who operated a small trucking company and had been present in the area during multiple disappearances. The investigation was meticulous, involving surveillance, background checks, and interviews with anyone who might have information. For the first time since Emma's disappearance, Margaret felt she was part of a professional investigation that might yield real results. The breakthrough came when they arrested a man for an unrelated offense and found photographs of several missing women hidden in his truck. The images were disturbing evidence of captivity and abuse, and they provided the first concrete proof that some of the missing women were being held against their will. However, Emma was not among the women in the photographs, and the man claimed he had never seen her photograph before. The investigation continued, expanding to include federal authorities who specialized in trafficking cases. As summer turned to fall in that Arizona town, Margaret felt a strange combination of hope and despair. They were making real progress in solving several missing persons cases, but each discovery that didn't include Emma felt like another door closing. She began to wonder if her single-minded focus on finding Emma had blinded her to the possibility that her daughter's case was fundamentally different from the others, that perhaps Emma's disappearance had been random rather than part of a larger pattern. The 9th year began with Margaret returning to Denver for the first time since she had started her nomadic search. The city looked different to her now, smaller somehow, less intimidating than the vast wilderness where she had been searching. She visited Emma's grave marker in the cemetery where her parents were buried, a memorial stone that David had installed on the 5th anniversary of Emma's disappearance, despite Margaret's protests that they didn't know Emma was dead. Standing in front of that stone, Margaret felt the full weight of 9 years settling on her shoulders. She was 52 years old now, her hair completely gray, her face lined with the accumulated stress of nearly a decade of searching. Her savings were nearly exhausted, her health was deteriorating, and she was no closer to finding Emma than she had been on that first terrible night when her daughter failed to come home. David met her for lunch at a restaurant they had frequented during their marriage. He looked older, too, though his new life with Susan had softened some of the sharp edges that grief had carved into his features. They talked about practical matters, the need to update Emma's missing persons files with new photographs showing how she might look now, the possibility of offering a larger reward for information, the question of whether to hold another public memorial. "Margaret," David said gently, reaching across the table to touch her hand, "I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to take it the wrong way. When does the searching end? When do we allow ourselves to grieve properly and try to rebuild our lives? The question hung between them like an accusation. Margaret pulled her hand away, feeling the familiar surge of anger that came whenever someone suggested she should give up. How could David, who claimed to love Emma as much as she did, even consider stopping the search? How could he speak of rebuilding when their daughter might still be alive somewhere, waiting for rescue? "I can't stop," Margaret said simply. "I won't stop. Not until I know what happened to her." David nodded, sadness evident in his eyes. "I know you can't. I know you won't. But I need you to know that doesn't make me love Emma less. It just makes me grieve differently." That conversation haunted Margaret as she prepared to leave Denver once again. She understood that David had found a way to live with not knowing, but she couldn't comprehend how he managed it. The not knowing was like a physical weight she carried everywhere, a constant awareness of incompleteness that made normal life impossible. The 10th year arrived like a milestone Margaret had never wanted to reach. A decade of searching, of hoping, of carrying the terrible burden, of not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead. Margaret marked the anniversary by returning to the house where she and Emma had lived during those final months before the disappearance. The new owners had painted it a different color and installed a fence around the front yard, but Margaret could still see Emma's bedroom window on the second floor, could remember the morning light streaming through those curtains as her daughter got ready for school. She sat in her RV across the street, watching the house and thinking about time, how 10 years had passed both instantly and eternally, how she felt simultaneously like the same woman who had kissed Emma goodbye that October morning, and like someone completely transformed by grief and obsession. She thought about all the miles she had traveled, all the faces she had shown Emma's photograph to, all the leads she had followed that had led to nothing but disappointment. A decade of searching had taught Margaret things about the world she wished she didn't know. She understood now how easily people could disappear, how many cracks existed in the system that was supposed to protect the vulnerable. She had learned about the underground networks that traded in human beings, about the way poverty and desperation made young people vulnerable to predators, about the heartbreaking frequency with which families were shattered by sudden, inexplicable loss. She had also learned about resilience, both her own and that of other searchers she had met along the way. Margaret had developed a network of parents, siblings, and friends of missing persons, people who understood the unique burden of loving someone who existed in the space between presence and absence. They shared resources, information, and occasionally hope when someone's missing loved one was found alive. These victories were rare but precious, proof that sometimes the impossible happened, that sometimes persistence was rewarded with miracle. The physical toll of 10 years showed in every line on Margaret's face, every ache in her joints as she climbed out of the RV. She was 53 now, but felt decades older, worn down by stress, poor sleep, and the constant tension of hope deferred. Her doctor had warned her about high blood pressure, about the need to reduce stress and take better care of herself, but Margaret couldn't imagine how to follow such advice while Emma remained missing. Margaret's relationship with David had evolved into something resembling a distant friendship. They exchanged emails about Emma's case, shared information when new leads developed, but the raw intensity of their shared grief had mellowed into something more manageable for David, more isolating for Margaret. David had learned to compartmentalize his loss, to function as a husband to Susan, a contributing member of his community, someone who could laugh at movies and enjoy dinner parties without constantly thinking about his missing daughter. Margaret envied David's ability to function normally, but she also resented it. How could he sit through a comedy film when Emma might be suffering somewhere? How could he plan vacations when their daughter's fate remained unknown? Margaret understood intellectually that David's approach might be healthier, but she couldn't make her heart accept what felt like abandonment of Emma's memory. The 10th anniversary brought unexpected media attention. A local news station ran a feature story about Margaret's decade-long search, portraying her as either a devoted mother or an obsessed woman, depending on the viewer's perspective. The story generated new tips, dozens of them, and Margaret spent weeks following up on each one with the desperate hope that had sustained her for 10 years. A woman in Oregon thought she had seen Emma working at a coffee shop. A trucker remembered picking up a hitchhiker who matched Emma's description 5 years earlier. A social worker in Texas had encountered a young woman who couldn't remember her past. Each tip required investigation, each investigation required hope, and each disappointment added weight to Margaret's accumulating despair. She was running out of money, running out of energy, running out of faith that answers were possible. The RV needed repairs she couldn't afford. Her health was deteriorating in ways she couldn't ignore, and for the first time in 10 years, Margaret began to contemplate the unthinkable, the possibility that she might have to stop searching. It was during this crisis of faith that Margaret received a call from Jack Morrison, the private investigator who had worked Emma's case in the early years. Jack had retired from active investigation but still monitored cold cases that had meant something to him, and Emma's disappearance was among them. He had news that made Margaret's heart stop. A body had been discovered in a remote area of Colorado, and while identification was still pending, the remains appeared to be those of a young woman who had been deceased for several years. Margaret drove through the night to reach the medical examiner's office, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. Part of her hoped desperately that the remains were Emma's, not because she wanted her daughter to be dead, but because knowing would end the terrible uncertainty that had consumed 10 years of her life. Another part of her prayed that the body was someone else, that Emma was still alive somewhere, still reachable. The medical examiner, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Collins, explained that the remains were too decomposed for visual identification, but that dental records and DNA testing would provide definitive answers within a few days. Margaret provided Emma's dental records and a DNA sample, then returned to her RV to wait in a limbo that felt even more acute than the usual uncertainty of not knowing. David arrived the next morning, looking as haggard as Margaret felt. They sat together in the medical examiner's waiting room, not talking much but drawing comfort from shared vigil. For the first time in years, Margaret felt connected to David in the way they had been during those first terrible weeks after Emma's disappearance, united in their love for their daughter and their need to know what had happened to her. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Dr. Collins delivered the news gently, but directly. The remains were not Emma's. The dental records didn't match, and the preliminary DNA results ruled out any possibility that they had found Margaret's daughter. Another family would receive the closure Margaret still craved, but Emma remained missing, her fate still unknown. Margaret's reaction surprised her. Instead of relief that Emma might still be alive, she felt a profound disappointment that bordered on despair. The not knowing continued, stretching ahead of her like an endless road with no destination. She was exhausted by hope, worn down by the constant cycle of possibility and disappointment that had defined her existence for 10 years. That night, alone in her RV in a parking lot outside the medical examiner's office, Margaret allowed herself to consider giving up for the first time since Emma had disappeared. She was tired of searching, tired of hoping, tired of carrying the weight of not knowing. Perhaps David was right. Perhaps there came a time when continuing to search became more about the searcher's inability to accept loss than about helping the missing person. But as she sat in the darkness, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of her decade-long quest, Margaret realized she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while Emma remained missing. Whatever had happened to her daughter, wherever Emma was now, Margaret owed her the commitment to keep searching until answers were found. It was the only way she knew how to love someone who existed in the space between hope and despair, the only way to honor a relationship that had been interrupted but not ended. Winter settled over Colorado with unusual severity as Margaret began her 11th year of searching for Emma. The cold seemed to penetrate everything, her aging RV, her arthritic joints, and the core of her being where hope once burned brightly. She had returned to Denver after the false identification, drawn back to the place where it all began. Perhaps seeking some connection to the life she had lived before, grief transformed her into someone unrecognizable. Margaret rented a small efficiency apartment in a complex that catered to transient residents, truck drivers, traveling nurses, people whose lives were defined by temporary attachments. The apartment was sparse, functional, containing only the essential items she had carried with her through years of searching. The walls remained bare, except for a single photograph of Emma, the same image that had appeared on thousands of missing person flyers, now faded from years of handling and exposure to sunlight. The return to stationary life felt strange after years of constant movement. Margaret found herself restless, uncomfortable with the stability that had once defined her existence. She took a part-time job at a local nonprofit that provided services to homeless individuals, work that allowed her to continue showing Emma's photograph while earning enough money to survive. The job brought her into contact with people who lived on the margins of society, addicts, mentally ill individuals, those who had fallen through the cracks of social services. Among these clients, Margaret encountered stories that both horrified and educated her. She met women who had been trafficked, men who had disappeared from their families for years before being found living on the streets, teenagers who had run away from abuse only to find themselves in more dangerous situations. Each story added to Margaret's understanding of the many ways people could vanish, the complexity of circumstances that led to disappearance, and the challenges faced by those trying to find their way back to families who might have given up searching. One client, a woman named Maria who appeared to be in her 30s but claimed to be only 24, told Margaret a story that made her blood run cold. Maria had been abducted at age 16 while walking home from school in Phoenix. She'd been held captive for 3 years, moved frequently between locations, forced into situations she could barely describe. Her escape had come when a facility was raided by federal agents, but by then she was addicted to drugs, traumatized beyond easy recovery, and convinced that her family had forgotten about her. The worst part, Maria told Margaret during one of their counseling sessions, wasn't what they did to me. It was believing that nobody was looking for me anymore. I thought my family had moved on, had other kids, had decided I was dead and gone. I didn't try to contact them because I thought I would just be a reminder of something they wanted to forget. Margaret listened to Maria's story with the mixture of professional compassion and personal terror that had become her default response to such accounts. She couldn't help but wonder if Emma was somewhere having similar thoughts, if her daughter believed that her family had stopped searching, stopped caring, stopped hoping for her return. The possibility that Emma might be alive but convinced that nobody loved her enough to keep looking was almost more devastating than imagining her dead. This conversation with Maria inspired Margaret to take a different approach to her search. Instead of focusing primarily on law enforcement and official channels, she began reaching out to social service organizations, homeless shelters, drug rehabilitation programs, and mental health facilities. She reasoned that if Emma was alive, if she had been through trauma similar to what Maria described, she might need help before she could reach out to her family. Margaret created new flyers with a different message. Instead of the standard missing person format, these flyers read, "Emma, we never stop looking," and included Margaret's contact information along with the message, "No questions asked, just come home." She distributed these flyers at places where someone like Maria might see them: bus stations, free clinics, soup kitchens, anywhere people in crisis might seek help. The new approach generated different kinds of responses. Margaret received calls from social workers who had encountered young women with amnesia or traumatic brain injuries, from shelter operators who had clients who couldn't remember their past, from advocates who worked with trafficking victims. None of these calls led to Emma, but they expanded Margaret's network of people who knew to watch for her daughter. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected opportunity. Sheriff Bradley from Arizona contacted Margaret with news about the trafficking investigation they had worked on together. Federal authorities had made additional arrests and were offering plea deals to suspects who provided information about other victims. One of the men in custody claimed to have information about several missing women, including some from Colorado. Margaret drove to Arizona immediately, her heart racing with the familiar mixture of hope and dread that accompanied every potential lead. The man who claimed to have information was serving time in federal prison, a predator whose crimes spanned decades and multiple states. His lawyer explained that his client was willing to provide information about missing persons cases in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The interview took place in a sterile conference room at the federal prison. The man, whose name was Charles Garrett, looked ordinary, middle-aged, balding, the kind of person who would blend into any crowd. Margaret sat across from him, fighting the urge to scream or strike him as he casually discussed the women he had harmed over the years. He seemed to enjoy having an audience for his crimes, describing details that made Margaret's skin crawl. When Margaret showed him Emma's photograph, Garrett studied it for a long moment before shaking his head. He claimed he had never seen Emma before, had never been to Denver during the time period when she disappeared. His lawyer confirmed that Garrett had been incarcerated in California during October 2014, making it impossible for him to have been involved in Emma's disappearance. The disappointment was crushing, but Margaret had learned to process such setbacks with grim efficiency. Each eliminated possibility was still progress. Another avenue crossed off her mental list of what might have happened to Emma. She drove back to Colorado feeling exhausted but not defeated, adding Garrett's information to her files, and continuing her methodical search. Summer brought an unexpected visitor to Margaret's apartment. Dr. Patricia Huang, a forensic psychologist who specialized in missing persons cases, had heard about Margaret's story through professional networks. Dr. Huang was conducting research on the families of long-term missing persons, studying the psychological impact of prolonged uncertainty and the coping mechanisms that allowed some families to function while others were destroyed by grief. Margaret agreed to participate in Dr. Huang's study, partly because she hoped it might provide insights that could help her search for Emma, but mostly because she had learned to accept help from any source that might advance her cause. The interviews were difficult, forcing Margaret to examine aspects of her decade-long obsession that she had never questioned. "What do you think Emma would want for you if she could see your life now?" Dr. Huang asked during one session. The question stopped Margaret cold. She had spent so many years focused on what Emma might need from her, on what she owed Emma as a mother, that she had never considered what Emma might want her to have for herself. Margaret thought about the person she had been before Emma's disappearance. Someone who enjoyed reading, who tended a small garden, who laughed at movies and looked forward to weekend adventures with her daughter. That person felt like someone she had known long ago, someone who had died the night Emma failed to come home. Could Emma possibly want her mother to live as a ghost, defined entirely by loss and searching? The question troubled Margaret for weeks after the interview ended. She found herself studying her reflection in mirrors, shocked by how much she had changed. Her hair was completely gray now, her face etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. Her hands, once soft from her work with books, were calloused from years of posting flyers and gripping steering wheels during long drives. She looked like someone who had been at war for 10 years, which perhaps she had been. Dr. Huang's research also connected Margaret with other families facing similar circumstances. She began attending support groups specifically for families of long-term missing persons, meeting people who understood the unique challenges of loving someone whose fate remained unknown. These groups provided comfort that Margaret hadn't realized she needed, the relief of being with people who didn't question her commitment to continuing the search. One member of the support group, a man named Robert Chen, whose sister had been missing for 15 years, shared an insight that resonated deeply with Margaret. "I realized that my sister would want me to live a life she could be proud of if she came back," he said during one meeting. "She wouldn't want to return to find that I had destroyed myself searching for her. She would want to find that I had carried our family's love forward, that I had found ways to honor her memory while still living." Robert's words planted a seed of doubt in Margaret's mind about the sustainability of her current path. She began to question whether her single-minded focus on searching had become more about her own inability to cope with loss than about actually helping Emma. Was she searching because it was the most effective way to find her daughter, or because stopping would mean accepting the possibility that Emma might never be found? The 11th anniversary of Emma's disappearance approached with a heaviness that felt different from previous years. Margaret found herself dreading the date, tired of marking time in increments of loss, exhausted by the annual ritual of hope and disappointment that had come to define her existence. She made the decision not to hold a public memorial this year, not to give interviews to local news stations, not to make the anniversary about anything other than private remembrance. Instead, Margaret spent the day alone in Emma's room, which she had maintained exactly as it had been 11 years earlier. She sat on the bed that still bore the indentation of her daughter's body, surrounded by the artifacts of a life interrupted, textbooks that would never be finished, clothes that would never be outgrown, dreams that hung in the air like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. For the first time in 11 years, Margaret allowed herself to truly imagine that Emma might be dead. She had always acknowledged this possibility intellectually, but had never let herself feel the full weight of what it would mean. If Emma was dead, then Margaret had spent 11 years searching for someone who couldn't be found, hoping for a reunion that would never happen, carrying a burden that served no purpose beyond self-punishment. The thought was simultaneously liberating and devastating. If Emma was dead, then Margaret was free to grieve properly, to remember her daughter without the constant weight of obligation to keep searching. But if Emma was alive, if she was somewhere waiting to be found, then giving up the search would be the ultimate betrayal, the moment when love proved insufficient to overcome despair. As autumn deepened into winter, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She would continue searching, but she would also begin to rebuild other aspects of her life. She enrolled in grief counseling, something she had resisted for 11 years because she didn't want to get over Emma's disappearance. She began to eat regular meals, exercise, and attend to her health in ways she had neglected during her years of obsessive searching. Most significantly, Margaret decided to transform her search into something larger than her personal quest to find Emma. She began working with other families of missing persons, sharing the knowledge and resources she had accumulated over 11 years. She helped organize search efforts for newly missing individuals, provided emotional support to families just beginning their own journeys through the wilderness of not knowing, and advocated for improvements in the systems designed to help find missing persons. This work gave Margaret a sense of purpose that felt different from her solitary search for Emma. She was still looking for her daughter, but she was also channeling her expertise and passion into efforts that might help other families avoid the prolonged agony she had endured. It felt like a way to honor Emma's memory, while also creating meaning from their shared tragedy. The 12th year began with Margaret finding a sustainable rhythm between searching for Emma and living a life that extended beyond that singular purpose. She had moved to a larger apartment, one with enough space for both her investigative materials and the normal accoutrements of daily life: a kitchen table for meals with friends, a comfortable chair for reading, a small garden on the balcony where she grew herbs and flowers. The transformation felt like a betrayal at first, as if comfort and normalcy were somehow incompatible with continuing to love and search for Emma. Margaret's work with other families had evolved into a consulting role with law enforcement agencies and nonprofit organizations that dealt with missing persons cases. Her expertise, hard-won through years of searching, made her valuable to investigators who recognized that civilian searchers often developed insights and resources that complemented official investigations. She helped train volunteers, advised on search strategies, and provided support to families navigating the complex emotions of prolonged uncertainty. One of Margaret's consulting clients was a police department in Fort Collins, Colorado, where a 17-year-old girl named Ashley Morrison had disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to Emma's case. Ashley had been walking home from school, had told friends she was meeting someone, and had vanished without a trace. The similarities were striking enough that Margaret wondered if the cases might be connected. Detective Sarah Liu, who was leading Ashley's investigation, welcomed Margaret's assistance with the kind of respect that acknowledged expertise regardless of its source. Detective Liu was young, thorough, and refreshingly free of the dismissive attitude toward civilian searchers that Margaret had encountered from some law enforcement officials over the years. Together, they analyzed the similarities between Ashley's and Emma's disappearances, looking for patterns that might indicate a common perpetrator. The investigation revealed interesting connections. Both girls had been active in school drama programs. Both had mentioned meeting someone before their disappearances. Both had vanished during October, exactly 5 years apart. The timing suggested either an incredibly unlikely coincidence or the work of someone who operated on a predictable schedule. Margaret threw herself into Ashley's case with an intensity that felt familiar, but different from her search for Emma. She was still driven by the need to find answers, but now her motivation extended beyond personal grief to include a professional obligation to help solve the case and potentially prevent future disappearances. The work felt like a way to channel her obsession productively while maintaining hope that solving Ashley's case might provide clues about what had happened to Emma. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired teacher named Helen Voss contacted Detective Liu after seeing news coverage about Ashley's disappearance. Mrs. Voss had taught drama at several high schools in the Denver area over a 30-year career, and she remembered both Emma and Ashley from summer theater workshops they had attended in different years. More importantly, she remembered another participant in those workshops, a man named Martin Reeves who had volunteered as a technical assistant for several years. Martin Reeves was in his 40s now, unmarried, employed as a maintenance worker at various schools and theaters throughout the region. His background check revealed a pattern of minor offenses: loitering near schools, inappropriate contact with minors, violations of restraining orders filed by former girlfriends. Nothing serious enough to warrant significant jail time, but a consistent pattern of behavior that suggested an unhealthy interest in young women. The investigation into Reeves required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, as his work history showed employment at schools and theaters across several counties. Margaret found herself in the unusual position of being included in official briefings, her decade of investigative work having earned her a place at the table where decisions were made about strategy and resources. Surveillance of Reeves revealed behavior that raised immediate red flags. He spent considerable time driving through neighborhoods where teenagers walked to and from school, often parking near bus stops and playgrounds. His apartment was located within walking distance of the theater, where both Emma and Ashley had participated in workshops. Most disturbing, he had taken vacation time from his current job during the weeks when both girls had disappeared. The decision to arrest Reeves was made on a Thursday morning in March. Margaret waited at the police station while officers executed the search warrant on his apartment, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. This could be the moment she had been waiting for 12 years, the answer to what had happened to Emma. Or it could be another dead end, another suspect who looked promising until investigation revealed he had no connection to her daughter's case. Detective Leo called Margaret with preliminary results from the search. Officers had found photographs of numerous young women, including some that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge. They had found journals containing detailed observations about the daily routines of various teenage girls. Most significantly, they had found items that belonged to Ashley Morrison, jewelry, clothing, personal effects that proved she had been in Reeves's apartment. But there was nothing that belonged to Emma. No photograph, no personal items, no mention of her name in the journals. Reeves's own records showed that he had been out of state during the time of Emma's disappearance, working at a theater festival in Oregon that provided him with an ironclad alibi for the relevant dates. The arrest of Martin Reeves solved Ashley Morrison's case and potentially prevented future disappearances, but it eliminated yet another possibility for what had happened to Emma. Margaret felt the familiar combination of relief and disappointment that had accompanied so many investigative breakthroughs over the years. She was grateful that Ashley's family would have answers, but the resolution of someone else's case only emphasized the continued mystery surrounding her own daughter's fate. Ashley Morrison was found alive, rescued from a hidden room in Reeves's basement, where she had been held for 8 months. The reunion between Ashley and her family was everything Margaret had dreamed of for herself and Emma. Tearful, joyful, proof that sometimes missing persons cases had happy endings. Margaret attended the press conference, where Ashley's safe return was announced, sitting in the back of the room and fighting tears of both happiness for the Morrison family and grief for her own continued uncertainty. The successful resolution of Ashley's case brought Margaret both recognition and opportunity. She was invited to speak at conferences about missing persons investigations, to consult on other cases that shared similarities with Emma's disappearance, to contribute her expertise to efforts aimed at improving the systems designed to help find missing people. The work was meaningful and felt like a way to honor Emma's memory while potentially helping other families avoid the prolonged agony Margaret had endured. But success in other cases also highlighted the unique challenges of Emma's disappearance. 12 years had passed without any credible sightings, any physical evidence, any suspects who couldn't be eliminated through investigation. Emma had vanished so completely that sometimes Margaret wondered if her daughter had ever existed at all, if the memories of their life together were elaborate fantasies created by a mind that couldn't accept the reality of loss. These doubts were dispelled by the physical evidence of Emma's existence. Photographs, school records, the testimony of friends and teachers who remembered her clearly. Emma had been real, had been loved, had been planning for a future that was interrupted by circumstances that remained unknown. The question wasn't whether Emma had existed, but what had happened to her, and whether she might still be alive somewhere, waiting to be found. As the 12th anniversary of Emma's disappearance approached, Margaret found herself in a place she could never have imagined during those first desperate months of searching. She had built a life that included grief without being defined entirely by it. She had found ways to honor Emma's memory while also creating meaning from their shared tragedy. She continued to search for Emma, but no longer believed that stopping the search would constitute abandonment or betrayal. The balance felt fragile, constantly threatened by new leads that might reignite her obsession or developments that might provide the answers she had sought for so long. Margaret understood now that loving someone who might be lost forever required learning to live with uncertainty, to find peace within questions that might never be answered, to maintain hope without being destroyed by its frequent disappointment. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 12 years and 3 days after Emma had disappeared. Margaret found it slipped under her apartment door, with no postmark, no return address, just her name written in handwriting she didn't recognize on a plain white envelope. The timing felt ominous. October had become a month Margaret dreaded, marked as it was by the anniversary of loss that had redefined her existence. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, her mind immediately cycling through possibilities. Over the years, she had received numerous anonymous letters, some from well-meaning individuals who thought they had information about Emma, others from cruel people who seemed to enjoy tormenting families of missing persons with false hope, or disturbing theories. She had learned to approach such communications with cautious optimism, prepared for disappointment but unable to ignore any potential source of information. The letter was written on expensive stationery, the kind used for formal correspondence. The handwriting was feminine, careful, with the slightly awkward quality of someone unaccustomed to writing by hand in an age of digital communication. Margaret read the first line and felt her knees buckle, forcing her to sit down at her kitchen table as the words blurred through tears she couldn't control. "Dear Mrs. Chen," the letter began, "my name is Emma Richardson, and I believe I might be your daughter." Margaret read the sentence 3 times before her brain could process its meaning. Emma Richardson, not Emma Chen, the name her daughter had been born with, but Emma Richardson, suggesting marriage or adoption or some other life change that would have been impossible unless Emma had survived her disappearance and built a new existence. The letter continued, "I know this must be shocking to receive, and I'm not even certain I should be writing to you. For 12 years I believed that my parents were dead, that I had no family left in the world. It's only recently that I've begun to remember things that don't match what I was told about my past. I think someone has been lying to me for a very long time." Margaret's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the letter steady enough to read. The possibility that Emma was alive, that she had been alive all these years while Margaret searched for her, was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. She forced herself to continue reading, desperate for details that might confirm or deny the impossible hope that was flooding through her system. "I don't remember much about my childhood before I was 15, the letter continued. I was told I had been in a car accident that killed my parents and caused me to have amnesia. The man who became my guardian, who I now know as my husband, told me he was a family friend who took me in out of kindness. He said I had no other relatives, that my parents had been only children with no siblings or extended family." Margaret felt sick as she read these words, understanding beginning to dawn about what might have happened to Emma. The timeline matched. Emma had disappeared at 17, and the letter mentioned memory beginning at 15, suggesting 2 years of captivity or manipulation before whatever process had convinced Emma that her captor was her savior. "But recently, I've been having dreams. Or maybe they're memories. I remember a woman with kind eyes who used to braid my hair. I remember a house with a big oak tree in the front yard. I remember playing guitar and wanting to be an actress. My husband says these are fantasies, symptoms of my brain injury, but they feel too real to be imaginary." The details made Margaret's heart race. Emma had indeed played guitar, had participated in drama programs, had loved having her hair braided. The house where they had lived during Emma's final years had featured a massive oak tree that Emma used to climb. These weren't details that would appear in news reports or missing person flyers. They were intimate family memories that only Emma would know. I started researching missing persons cases online, looking for someone who might match my dreams. When I found your daughter Emma's information, I felt like I was looking at a picture of myself from another life. We have the same birthmark, the same scar on our chin, the same unusual eye color. But more than that, when I looked at the photos of your family, I felt something I can only describe as recognition." Margaret scrambled to find Emma's missing person file, comparing the details in the letter to the physical characteristics she had memorized long ago. The birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on the left shoulder, the small scar on the chin from a childhood bicycle accident, the unusual hazel eyes that shifted between green and brown depending on the light. These were details that had been shared with law enforcement but not widely publicized. "I know you probably receive letters like this all the time, and I know how cruel false hope can be. I don't want to cause you pain if I'm wrong about who I am, but I also can't ignore the possibility that I might be your daughter, that I might have a mother who has been looking for me all these years." The letter included a phone number and an address in a small town in Wyoming, about 3 hours' drive from Denver. Margaret stared at the contact information, torn between the desperate need to immediately verify whether this could really be Emma and the fear that investigating might lead to another devastating disappointment. After 12 years of false leads and dead ends, could this really be the answer she had sought for so long? Margaret called Detective Liu, the only law enforcement officer she trusted completely after their work together on Ashley Morrison's case. Detective Liu listened to Margaret read the letter, asking careful questions about the details mentioned and the potential for this to be either a genuine contact from Emma or an elaborate hoax. "The personal details are compelling," Detective Liu acknowledged, "but we need to approach this carefully. If this really is Emma, she's been living under the control of someone who convinced her that her family was dead. She might be in danger if her captor realizes she's reached out to you. And if this isn't Emma, confronting someone who's suffering from genuine amnesia or mental health issues could be harmful to them. They developed a plan that balanced Margaret's desperate need for immediate answers with the practical requirements of protecting everyone involved. Detective Liu would make the initial contact, identifying herself as a law enforcement officer investigating a missing persons case and asking if the letter writer would be willing to meet with Margaret under supervised conditions. The phone call was arranged for the following day. Margaret sat in Detective Liu's office, listening on a speakerphone as the detective dialed the number from the letter. When a woman answered, Margaret's heart stopped. The voice was unfamiliar, deeper than Emma's had been, marked by an accent Margaret didn't recognize. But there was something in the cadence, something in the way the woman said, hello, that sent chills down Margaret's spine. Detective Liu explained who she was and why she was calling. The woman on the phone, who identified herself as Emma Richardson, responded with a mixture of fear and relief that suggested someone who had been expecting this contact, but dreading its implications. I was afraid to call you directly, Emma Richardson said. My husband doesn't know I found the missing person information, doesn't know I've been having these memories. He gets very upset when I talk about wanting to remember my past. He says it's unhealthy, that I should focus on the life we've built together rather than dwelling on trauma I can't change. Margaret bit her tongue to keep from crying out. The woman's voice was different from Emma's. But voices changed over 12 years, especially voices belonging to people who had experienced trauma. The woman's manner of speaking, her vocabulary, her way of constructing sentences, all of it felt familiar in ways Margaret couldn't quite articulate. They arranged to meet the following weekend at a neutral location, a coffee shop in a town halfway between Denver and the address Emma Richardson had provided. Detective Liu would be present, along with a colleague who specialized in cases involving trafficking and long-term captivity. If this meeting confirmed that Emma Richardson was indeed Margaret's missing daughter, they would need to move carefully to ensure her safety while gathering evidence against whoever had been holding her. Margaret spent the week in a state of suspended animation, unable to focus on anything except the approaching meeting. She alternated between absolute certainty that Emma Richardson was her daughter and equally absolute conviction that this was another cruel coincidence that would end in disappointment. She prepared for both possibilities, gathering photographs and documents that might help confirm Emma Richardson's identity, while also steeling herself for the possibility that this lead would prove false like so many others. The night before the meeting, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this encounter might unfold. If Emma Richardson really was Emma, what would it mean that she had been alive all these years, living as someone else's wife, convinced that her family was dead? How much of the Emma that Margaret remembered would still exist in this woman who had lived 12 years under someone else's control? And if Emma Richardson wasn't Emma, if this was just another case of mistaken identity or deliberate deception, how would Margaret find the strength to continue? 12 years of searching had brought her to this moment, this possibility that felt more real and more promising than any lead she had followed before. If this wasn't Emma, Margaret wasn't sure she could survive the disappointment. Margaret arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, despite Detective Liu's advice to maintain normal routines and avoid appearing desperate or unstable. She sat in a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold from neglect. Every time the door opened, her heart stopped, but the customers who entered were strangers. Elderly couples, young mothers with children, business travelers checking their phones. Detective Liu arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, accompanied by Detective Rodriguez, a specialist in trafficking cases who had worked with numerous victims of long-term captivity. They sat at a nearby table, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid intimidating Emma Richardson during what would surely be an emotionally charged encounter. At exactly 2 o'clock, a woman entered the coffee shop, and Margaret's world tilted on its axis. She was tall, slender, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face was older than Margaret remembered, marked by lines that suggested years of stress or worry, but the bone structure was unmistakably familiar. When the woman turned toward Margaret's table, their eyes met, and Margaret saw the unusual hazel color that had been noted in every missing person report filed over the past 12 years. The woman approached slowly, her expression a mixture of hope and terror that mirrored Margaret's own emotional state. When she was close enough to speak, she said simply, "Mrs. Chen, I'm Emma Richardson." Her voice was different from what Margaret remembered, deeper, more cautious. But something in the way she held her head, something in the gesture she made with her left hand, sent recognition flooding through Margaret's consciousness. "Emma?" Margaret whispered, rising from her seat on unsteady legs. "Is it really you?" The woman, Emma, nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I think so. I hope so. I remember you braiding my hair. I remember you singing to me when I was sick. I remember the way you smelled like lavender and books." Margaret closed the distance between them in 2 steps, pulling Emma into an embrace that felt like coming home after 12 years of wandering in the wilderness. Emma's body was different. Taller, thinner, more angular than the 17-year-old girl who had disappeared, but something in the way she held herself, something in the rhythm of her breathing, felt achingly familiar. They cried together for several minutes, holding each other as if afraid that separation might make this moment dissolve into another cruel dream. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret studied Emma's face with the intensity of someone memorizing a miracle. The scar on her chin was there, slightly faded but still visible. The crescent-shaped birthmark was hidden beneath her clothing, but Margaret could see the edge of it at her collar. This was Emma. This was her daughter. Detective Liu approached their table after giving them time for the initial reunion, introducing herself and Detective Rodriguez, before explaining the need to gather information about Emma's circumstances over the past 12 years. Emma's story, told haltingly over the course of several hours, was both heartbreaking and enraging. She had been abducted on her way home from drama club rehearsal by a man named Richard Richardson, who had been monitoring her routine for weeks. Richardson, who was in his late 40s at the time, had drugged Emma and transported her to a remote cabin in Wyoming, where he held her captive for over 2 years. During this time, he had used a combination of physical restraint, psychological manipulation, and drugs to convince Emma that her family had died in a car accident and that he was her only connection to the outside world. "He showed me fake newspaper articles about the accident," Emma explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He had photographs that he said were from the crash scene. He told me that I had been injured too, that my memory problems were because of brain trauma from the accident. He said he was taking care of me because my parents had been his best friends, and he had promised to look after me if anything happened to them." The psychological manipulation had been systematic and sophisticated. Richardson had isolated Emma completely from outside contact, convincing her that the world beyond his property was dangerous, and that her damaged memory made her vulnerable to people who might take advantage of her confusion. When he finally allowed her limited freedom, he had created a new identity for her. Emma Richardson, his wife, a young woman with no family or past beyond what he had constructed for her. "The worst part," Emma said, meeting Margaret's eyes with difficulty, "was that part of me was grateful to him. He had convinced me that he was saving me, that without him I would be helpless and alone. Even when things felt wrong, even when I had dreams that didn't match what he told me about my past, I thought I owed him my loyalty." Detective Rodriguez explained that this type of psychological manipulation was common in long-term captivity cases, that Emma's response was normal rather than a sign of weakness or complicity. The process of breaking down a victim's sense of identity and replacing it with dependence on the captor was a well-documented phenomenon that could affect anyone, regardless of intelligence or strength of character. Margaret listened to Emma's story with a mixture of relief, grief, and rage that threatened to overwhelm her ability to function. Relief that Emma was alive, that the search was finally over, that her daughter had been found. Grief for the 12 years they had lost, for the young woman Emma had been before her abduction, for the innocence and trust that could never be fully restored. And rage at Richard Richardson, who had not only stolen Emma's life, but had convinced her that her family was dead, that no one was looking for her, that she was alone in the world except for him. The investigation into Richardson's activities revealed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning decades. Emma was not his first victim. Law enforcement discovered evidence of at least 3 other young women who had been held captive by Richardson over the years, though Emma was the only one who had survived long enough to escape. The others had died in his custody, their bodies buried on his remote property in Wyoming. Richardson's capture required careful planning to ensure Emma's safety. He believed that Emma was simply visiting relatives in Colorado, unaware that she had contacted law enforcement or that her true identity had been discovered. When officers arrested him at his home in Wyoming, he was found with detailed plans for relocating Emma to an even more remote location, suggesting that he had become suspicious of her recent behavior. The reunion between Emma and her father David was almost as emotional as her meeting with Margaret. David had maintained hope for 12 years, but had also begun the process of accepting that Emma might never be found. Seeing his daughter alive, holding her again, after more than a decade of uncertainty, reduced him to tears in a way that Margaret had never witnessed during their marriage or their years of shared searching. Emma's reintegration into her family's life was complicated by the years of psychological manipulation she had endured. She had no memory of much of her childhood, no clear sense of who she had been before her abduction. The dreams and flashes of memory that had led her to contact Margaret were fragments rather than coherent recollections, pieces of her former self that Richardson's manipulation had not been able to completely erase. Dr. Patricia Huang, the forensic psychologist who had studied Margaret's case, became involved in Emma's recovery process. She explained that healing from long-term psychological manipulation would be a gradual process, that Emma's memories might return partially or might remain permanently fragmented. The important thing was to focus on building new relationships and experiences rather than trying to force Emma to remember a past that might be irretrievably lost. Margaret struggled with her own complex emotions about Emma's return. The joy of having her daughter back was tempered by grief for the years they had lost and anger at the man who had stolen them. She had to learn to relate to Emma as the woman she had become, rather than the 17-year-old girl who had disappeared. To accept that some aspects of their relationship might never be recovered. But there were moments of pure happiness that reminded Margaret why she had never stopped searching. When Emma laughed at something Margaret said, Margaret heard echoes of the girl she remembered. When Emma unconsciously hummed while reading, Margaret recognized a habit that had survived 12 years of captivity. These glimpses of continuity suggested that Emma's essential self had endured despite everything she had experienced. The trial of Richard Richardson became a media sensation, drawing attention to the case and highlighting the issue of long-term missing persons. Margaret testified about the 12 years she had spent searching for Emma, about the impact of not knowing what had happened to her daughter. Emma's testimony was more difficult, as she struggled to remember details about her captivity and worried about the implications of her years of apparent compliance with Richardson's demands. Richardson was ultimately convicted on multiple counts, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder in connection with his other victims. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he could never harm another young woman. The conviction provided a sense of justice that helped both Margaret and Emma begin to heal from their respective traumas. As Margaret sat in the courtroom listening to the judge read Richardson's sentence, she reflected on the 12-year journey that had brought them to this moment. The search for Emma had consumed her life, transforming her from a quiet librarian into someone harder and more determined than she had ever imagined she could become. The experience had cost her her health, her savings, her sense of security in the world, but it had also led to this moment of justice and reunion. Emma would need years of therapy to fully recover from her experience, and their relationship would require careful rebuilding. But she was alive, she was free, and she was home. After 12 years of searching, Margaret had found what she had never stopped believing she would find: her daughter, and the truth about what had happened to her. The letter that had started it all, Emma's brave decision to reach out despite years of being told her family was dead, had proven that sometimes the impossible happened, that sometimes persistence was rewarded with miracles. Margaret kept that letter framed on her kitchen table, a reminder that love could survive any distance, any manipulation, any attempt to destroy it. What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories coming.